that's a trend that will cause a lot of alarm in the Republican Party, even if President Trump still clearly has kind of a very firm grip on the MAGA base.
I think it's been fascinating to watch the split screen of, on the one hand, these fairly negative polling numbers for the president on the economy, on immigration, on the war in Iran, and yet a point where President Trump has felt really emboldened. I mean, look at these primary races that we're talking about, where President Trump and his MAGA team have won. You know, Indiana, where they were able to defeat 5 out of 7 of those state legislators who had decided not to go with the president on redistricting, so redrawing congressional lines in their state. You had Senator Bill Cassidy in Louisiana, who in 2021 had voted in favor of impeaching President Trump, and that revenge came right around now where he lost his primary in Louisiana. And then Thomas Massie, of course, you know, the most expensive House primary race, where this was the most public battle between President Trump and the congressman losing this one. And there's another big test next week in Texas, where you have the Senate Republican primary runoff between John Cornyn, who's the incumbent, a longtime senator, and who President Trump endorsed, who's the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who is kind of a full-throated MAGA candidate. And I think, you know, Texas in a way is particularly interesting because you saw a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill concerned and upset about the fact that President Trump endorsed not the incumbent, not the man who's sitting in the Senate right now, John Cornyn, but his opponent. But that in a way also shows how President Trump feels right now. He's looking at these victories across the board and saying, I am at the zenith of my power in the Republican Party, and I can take those risks. I'm able to, whether he sees it as a risk or not, I can make those decisions because this is my party, and clearly the voting in these primaries shows that.
I wonder about the strategy here because, you know, Bernie, as you said, these are primary elections. It's only the really super card-carrying members of both parties who really kind of go and get involved in primary elections. And the administration, the president, celebrating the wins of the MAGA candidates and the candidates that he's backed. I wonder if he's thinking ahead to a situation where there are potentially uncomfortable votes in the next Congress, and he wants the Republicans who are there to not vote against him. And what is the best way of securing that outcome for himself next year is to make sure that the Republicans who are in seats are loyal to him, that they are not the ones who might be persuaded to side with the Democrats on some issues, but who will remember that he backed them and he helped them to get elected, and that he's expecting a trade in loyalty in return. Because, you know, obviously the margin is so thin in the House right now. I don't think anyone's expecting, even with all the redistricting, that there'll be some huge Republican majority next year. There may not be a huge Democratic majority either, even though some Democrats are very hopeful of that. So, you know, when you see all of this money going into races, like of people competing against themselves, basically, right? They're not competing against their opponent. They're not competing for security or power in the House. It's like, what is the long game here when you're putting so much money and effort into an internal battle, not a battle that's about keeping power for your whole party, but about keeping power for yourself?
I think that's a huge takeaway for Trump and a very big part of the lessons learned, you know, for the Republican Party. I mean, in some ways, this was very much a revenge tour in which he took aim at people who kind of broke with what he wanted. I mean, I think Thomas Massie is obviously the best example. Criticized how he handled the Epstein files, has been critical of him for quite some time now. I think other lawmakers will see that and take away the lesson that, you know, if one crosses President Trump will then come back even, you know, towards the tail end of his presidency, kind of the next election, and he still has an enormous impact. And then that doesn't end in the next year, that doesn't end in 2 years. He's someone who remembers things for a very long time. He's very happy to tell reporters that he kind of holds grudges for quite some time, and I think a lot of lawmakers will be kind of cognizant of that and think about that before they speak out against any particular policy.
President Trump has, in the meantime, created a small caucus, perhaps inadvertently, in Congress that no longer feels it has to be completely loyal to him. So think about Senator Bill Cassidy, Senator Thom Tillis, who's retiring, now Congressman Thomas Massie. And that means that they can actually put their foot down on until they're out of office, which is not until January of next year, on some of the president's initiatives. President Trump has been out on social media warning Republicans, saying you better get in line or you will be out of a job. But for those who are going to be out of a job anyways, that doesn't matter so much, of course. On the other hand, I think what Democrats have to see as a warning here is President Trump and his aligned super PACs can pour so much money into races that could make some of those seats where Democrats are feeling pretty comfortable and safe all the more difficult.
Just this week we heard him threaten Lauren Boebert, who is super loyal to the president, except he would see it regarding the issue around the Epstein files. She's been one of the most vocal people about publicizing those, and she even posted on her social media on Tuesday night, Trump is my president, lest there be any ambiguity there. And we've also seen him threaten Brian Fitzpatrick, the quite moderate Republican in Pennsylvania as well. So it's interesting that he's kind of keeping everyone on their toes like that. And how will we see that play out in the months ahead of the midterm elections, the last few months of this Congress, when, as you say, the margins are so tight as they are? Who knows?
And I think it'll be fascinating to see what people like Thomas Massie do. I mean, how far they push it. And Massie, for example, has already been on the podcast circuit, and I think it's not outside the realm of possibility that he'll be extremely outspoken, even more so than now. And at that point, it's not just that he's speaking to Republicans or the MAGA base. He's speaking to everyone, and people want to hear what he has to say about President Trump. I think in the longer term, that's a challenge. And about the Democrats, I also think it's interesting because I think in some cases, Kevin Paxton in Texas, for example, they would almost rather face a Trump-aligned candidate than kind of a moderate Republican that they think can kind of cross aisles and speak to those sort of middle of the road voters. I think at least in some cases they see it as the preferred option because they can point to an association with President Trump, and they think that will be kind of a successful tactic.
That's been the warning from Republicans on Capitol Hill, who say if you put in a more extreme MAGA candidate, some of those more moderate Republican voters might go to the Democrat. And in Texas, that's what they're concerned will actually happen there. But at the same time, again, that money and spending spree and kind of the negative ads that will be ramping up, we're already seeing that against the Democrat there, James Tallarico, who's been called a vegan by President Trump because he ordered a potato, cheese, and egg taco, which apparently is not an authentic taco, which I should say, by the way, is not vegan anyways, but regardless, that's neither here nor there. They will obviously be ramping up their attacks on him as well, and that might be effective in being able to paint him as a liberal, woke, progressive, left-wing Democrat, and I think that is going to be the real and probably fairly nasty battle that we see heading towards the midterms. And even if President Trump has more MAGA candidates put in place to run in several of these really important seats, I think he and his team feel quite confident that they'll be able to win those seats.
So Texas will be a hot race in more ways than one. But, with any of these, whether the Democrat is facing a super MAGA candidate or not, it depends on the Democratic candidate, doesn't it? I mean, we're seeing quite a variance in terms of, types of candidates and backgrounds and interests in some of these really tight races as well. And it's going to come down, as it always does in midterm elections, who's better at getting out the vote? What is the apparatus like? They're midterm elections. They're notoriously hard to get people sort of interested in and motivated by. And it's going to be about money, as American politics are, which is always bamboozling to those of us not from America, how much cash, how many millions are spent on races. It's going to come down to that, and it's going to come down to party organisation. But it will be a fascinating one to watch. And spoiler alert, we will be talking about this a lot for the next few months. But I think we're out of time for today talking about this, although we could go for many hours more.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about it again, I'm sure, next week. Great to see you guys.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.